the nation's finest hour, certainly in my memory. A time when people became larger than themselves and maybe, to coin a phrase, larger than life, because hundreds of thousands, no doubt millions, white and black, found something to believe in that was outside of themselves and bigger than they.
James Farmer taught at Mary Washington College from 1985 until just before he passed away in the summer of 1999. He was an incredible teacher, an incredible lecturer, and I would argue that his time in the classroom was one of the most significant moments in American public education, where a great leader, a leader in the American Civil Rights Movement, had the opportunity for more than a decade to interact with students on a regular basis and to regale them with the stories of the front lines of the civil rights movement.
Now to the march itself. Many people wonder how it started, and they assume that maybe Dr. King one day said, "Come on, y'all, let's march." And everybody got together and marched. No, not so. Or Roy Wilkins, or Whitney Young, or maybe Farmer. No, indeed.
He brought the strategies of peaceful, nonviolent resistance to the movement in the early 1940s. He was the founder and organizer of the Congress of Racial Equality, and of course he was the inspiration for the 1961 Freedom Rides. He thought that any of the civil rights organizations that existed in the 1940s and 1950s were ill prepared for the task because they focused on one particular thing. So the Fellowship of Reconciliation was a pacifist organization. The NAACP used legal tactics. The Urban League sought to use economic tactics. And he thought that instead, a grassroots organization that would bring together folks of different faiths, of different backgrounds, and of different political beliefs that could spring up spontaneously at various moments in various places to lend effort to the larger, broader movement was an absolutely critical organization. And of course, the history of the civil rights movement demonstrates that CORE and its grassroots nature and the birth that it gave to groups throughout the country was absolutely essential to the success of the movement. James Farmer's life was always being present at the creation, but never being there for the big moment. And so he retells in his autobiography the story of the March on Washington. Of course, it was a big event. All of the civil rights groups were coming together. It was going to be a significant historical moment in the nation's history, but he wasn't there. He was scheduled to be on the dais that day as one of the dozen or so speakers selected to deliver remarks, but instead he was in Plaquemine, Louisiana in jail.
I watched the March on Washington on television, however. Local citizens of this town in Louisiana, Plaquemine, in Iberville Parish, brought me a television set, and the jailers allowed them to bring it up to my cell. I watched it and I was impressed. I wept during some of the speeches. I wept especially during the speech of a rabbi and Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers, and particularly during the now famous speech of Martin Luther King Jr., "I have a dream." And I wished, of course, that I'd been there.
As one of the nation's distinguished civil rights leaders, he was given the opportunity to leave and could have attended the march, but declined because he would have left behind those that were marching with him, and he chose not to do that. One of the stories that he always enjoyed telling students at Mary Washington was his days in the 1960s debating Malcolm X. Of course, Malcolm X was the fiercest debater on the American political scene in the 1960s, and while most of the civil rights movement leaders tended to stay away from Malcolm and urged James Farmer not to debate him, he said absolutely not. Instead, he chose on numerous occasions to engage Malcolm X in verbal disputation and argument.
After we had had 5 or 6 debates, Malcolm suggested that we stop debating each other. I agreed with him. I met him on 125th Street. He invited me to have coffee with him in their restaurant, a Muslim's restaurant, Shabazz restaurant. And he said, "Brother James, I think we ought to stop debating each other because we're not doing anything but conducting a circus of two black guys belting each other's brains out for the amusement of largely white audiences. And I know what you're going to say, and you know what I'm going to say. I'm not going to convince you, and you're not going to convince me. That I could make your speech for you, and you could make my speech for me. In fact, you did once.
Farmers' freedom rides were an explosive, troubling, and threatening episode for the Kennedys in the early 1960s. A new president trying to establish his presidency, of course dealing with the Soviet threat, and you had a renegade civil rights leader that was getting on buses and going to the Deep South and causing a ruckus and turmoil. To the extent that he was a leader of the Freedom Rides, he forced the Kennedys to move aggressively to ultimately bring in the National Guard and offer protection for the Freedom Riders, which was something that the Kennedys didn't want to have to deal with. Of course, when the Freedom Rides made national news, in fact international news, with the Greyhound bus, which the image is seared in history books across the nation, when that happened and it became evident that there was a serious race problem in America, and one that the Kennedys would have to deal with, it changed the national conversation. Now, we'll never know the degree to which John Kennedy himself would have pushed for some of the momentous civil rights legislation that occurred immediately after his death or his assassination. But certainly we could say that James Farmer was a thorn in the side of the Kennedy brothers, and one that forced the Kennedy administration to deal with the race problem in America perhaps sooner than they would have liked. One of the stories that Farmer tells about his impact on the American presidency was that he sat with Lyndon Johnson during the momentous civil rights legislation of the mid-1960s and made the case for and argued for what we know as affirmative action today. And some historians have referred to him as the father of affirmative action. In 1998, President William Jefferson Clinton presented James Farmer with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. And in doing so, Clinton said, frankly, I don't think that he's gotten the credit or the recognition that he deserves. And I think that that's probably a fitting legacy. Farmer was, in many ways, the unsung hero of the civil rights movement. Always there, present at the creation, but always missing the big moment to be on the grand stage. But one of the things that President Clinton did in awarding him that medal was to recognize a lifetime of achievement, which was a significant contribution to the American story. Those that become familiar with James Farmer's story, I would hope that they learn and take away the idea that one person who dedicates themselves to a cause greater than themselves, is able to make a difference. That's certainly what James Farmer did. That's what his life story was about, and that's the beautiful gift that he's bequeathed to us here at Mary Washington and to students across the country.